Audiobook. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Author, Irving Stone. Book 9. The War. Where did a man go when he had been destroyed? Where else but to work, bolting the door of his studio, standing the dozen blocks around the walls as though they were armed soldiers guarding his privacy. The new studio was a pleasure, ceilings 35 feet high, tall windows to the north, spacious enough to allow him to carve several of the tomb figures at the same time. This was where a sculptor belonged, in his workshop. Since he had signed a contract with Michelangelo Buonarotti in Rome to do the risen Christ, he decided to do this single piece first. His drawing hand revealed that he could not design a risen Christ because in his mind Christ had never died. There had been no crucifixion and no entombment. No one could have killed the Son of God, not Pontius Pilate, not all of the Roman legions stationed in Galilee. Christ's corded muscular arms held the cross lightly, its transverse beam too short for man or even child to be nailed to. The symbols were there, the bamboo rod poetically curved, the sponge soaked in vinegar, but in his white marble there would be no sign of anguish, no reminder of the ordeal. He walked to Santa Maria Novella by way of the Central Market in the Via Sant'Antonio, went to the choir stalls and gazed up at the robust Christ of Girlanteo for which he had drawn the sketches. He had never believed that spirituality had to be anemic or aesthetic. The small clay model shaped itself easily under his hands, then the studio was christened with the first flying white chips, seeming to Michelangelo as pure as holy water. A group of old friends came to celebrate his entering the block, Bugardini, Rustici, Baccio d'Agnolo. Granexi poured the Chianti, raised his glass and cried, "I drink to the 3 late lamented years. Requiescat in pace. Now let us drink to the years to come, when all these brave blocks shall spring to life. Beviamo. Auguri. Best wishes." After his 3-year fast, the risen Christ surged out of its column. Having persuaded Vari to contract for a nude figure, his chisel sang out the contours of the standing male in an equilibrium of proportion, the head gazing downward lyrically upon man, the sweet calm tranquility of Jesus' virile face saying to all who looked upon him, "Have faith in God's goodness. I have surmounted my cross. I have conquered it. So can you, yours. Violence passes. Love remains." Because the statue had to be shipped to Rome, he left the webbing between the left arm and torso and between the 2 feet, nor did he attempt to articulate the hair, since it might break off, or give the face a high polish that could be scratched on the journey. The day it was shipped, Soggy came to visit the studio, fairly bursting out of his own tight red sausage-like skin. "Michelangelo, I just held a world competition for sculpture." "Oh. And where did you hold it?" "In my head. I'm happy to tell you that you won." "What have I won, Soggy?" "The right to carve a calf for the front of my new butcher shop." "Of marble?" "Certainly." "Soggy, I promised myself that I would never sculpture a calf unless it was of pure gold. Like the one the Hebrews were worshipping when Moses came down from Mount Sinai." Soggy's eyes bulged. "Gold? That would be spectacular. How thin a plating could we use?" "Plating? Soggy, I'm shocked. Do you put only a plating of meat in your sausages? To do your shop justice, the calf must be solid gold, from the tip of its nose to the last hair in its tail." Soggy, his face dripping perspiration, cried, "Do you know how much a solid gold calf would cost? 1,000,000 florins. But it would make you famous." Soggy moved his head back and forth mournfully. "No use to cry over spoiled meat. I'll just have to start a new competition." "You're not eligible." He would earn little in the coming years, since the risen Christ netted him less than 200 ducats, and the figures for Julius' tomb had been paid for in advance. Yet he was still the sole support of his family. His brother Buonarroti now had 2 children and a third on the way. Buonarroti was sickly, could work little. Giovansimone spent his days in the wall shop, but he had no business sense. His brother Sigismondo had not been trained for any trade except war. When Lodovico became ill, there were constant doctor and apothecary bills. The income from the farm seemed to trickle away. He was going to have to cut his costs. Buonarroti, now that I'm back in Florence, don't you think your time would be better spent in handling my affairs? Buonarroti was crushed. His face went gray. You want to close our shop? It's not making money. Only because I've been ill. As soon as I'm better I can go to business every day. What would Giovansimone do? And Michelangelo realized that the business was necessary to maintain Buonarroti's and Giovansimone's social position. With it they were merchants, without it they were dependents, living off their brother. He could do nothing to hurt his family name. You're right, Buonarroti, he said with a sigh. The shop will make money one day. The tighter he bolted his studio door against the intrusion of the outside world, the more evident it became that trouble was man's natural state. News reached him that Leonardo da Vinci had died in France, unwanted and unhonored by his countrymen. A letter from Sebastiano in Rome told him that Raphael was ill and exhausted, obliged to turn more and more of his work over to apprentices. The Medici were beset by difficulties. Alfonsina, suffering from ulcers over the loss of her son and the control of Florence, crept away to Rome to die. Pope Leo's political judgment had proved unsound in the backing of Francis I of France against Charles V, now the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor of Spain, Germany and the Netherlands. In Germany, Martin Luther was challenging papal supremacy by crying, "I don't know if the Christian faith can endure any other head of the universal church on earth, save Christ." After immuring himself for weeks, Michelangelo attended a dinner of the Company of the Cauldron. Granici came to the studio so they could walk to Rustici's together. He had inherited the family fortune and was living in austere respectability with his wife and 2 children in the ancestral home in Santa Croce. When Michelangelo expressed surprise at Granici's devotion to his business affairs, Granici replied formally, "Each generation is the custodian of family property. Perhaps you'll become serious about your talent as well, and do some painting." "Ah, well, talent. You have not neglected your talent, and look what you've been through. I'm still intent on enjoying life. What else is left, after the years have passed? Bitter reflections. If I don't have wonderful sculptures to show that the years have passed, then my memories will be truly bitter." Rustici's still had the same studio in the Via della Sapienza, where they had celebrated the David Commission. While passing through the Piazza San Marco, Michelangelo saw a familiar figure. He went faint, grabbed Granici's arm. It was Agony, talking to a 19-year-old goldsmith and apprentice sculptor, Benvenuto Cellini, laughing heartily and throwing his arms wide. They had no sooner arrived at Rustici's than Cellini came in, made straight for Michelangelo. "That Agony is an animal. He told me that you used to go together to the Church of the Carmen to learn drawing from the Masaccios, and that one day when you were bantering him he gave you such a blow on the nose that he felt the bone crumble beneath his knuckles." Michelangelo's face became grim. "Why do you repeat his story to me, Cellini?" "Because his words begat in me such a hatred for the man that although I was considering going to England with him, he's looking for several assistants for a commission there, I know now I could never bear the sight of him." it was good to have a group of his friends and fellow Florentines about him in the closely knit company. He had recommended Jacopo Sansovino for an important commission in Pisa, and Jacopo had forgiven him for not being allowed to participate in the now-defunct facade. So had Baccio d'Agnolo, who had become famous for the beauty of his inlaid wood mosaics. By Gardini, with a commission from Palerusoli to do an altarpiece of the Martyrdom of St. Catherine for Santa Maria Novella, was having trouble with his drawing. Michelangelo had spent several evenings with his old friend outlining in charcoal a design of nudes, wounded and dead, falling forward and backward, to catch a variety of light and shadow on their strong figures. The only sour note was Baccio Bandinelli, who would not look in Michelangelo's direction. Michelangelo studied the men who had been fighting him ever since the Perugino quarrel, 31, with the nose that was wire-thin at the bridge but flared wide at the nostrils, heavy-lidded eyes that were deceptively lethargic, and the nimblest, fastest-talking lips in Tuscany. He had been awarded several commissions by the Medici. Cardinal Giulio had recently given him an Orpheus and Cerberus to do. "What is it that he can't forgive me?" Michelangelo asked Granexi. "The fact that he destroyed my cartoon for the bathers? That you were born, live, breathe and carve? The very fact that there is such a person as Michelangelo Buonarrotti poisons the air for him. If you didn't exist, he believes he would be the first marble master of Italy. Would he be? He made an incredible botch of the Hercules and Cacus for the ring Ira of the Signoria. But he's a skilled goldsmith, and favorite of the Medici because his father saved their gold plate during the sack. You can become as bad a sculptor as he is, or make him as good as you are. Nothing short of this will ever placate him." Agnolo Doni, for whom he had painted the Holy Family, had wangled an unofficial membership in the company by sponsoring a number of their more expensive parties. As Michelangelo's fame had grown, so had the legend of their friendship. Doni had them being an unbeatable combination on the Santa Croce football team. Michelangelo had lived as much in Doni's home as his own. Doni had encouraged him in his art. What Michelangelo now grasped was that, over the 15 years of expanding and telling, Doni had come to believe his own tall tales. When Doni was relating to Aristotile da San Gallo how he had forced the rear door of a palace late one night and held the candle while Michelangelo sketched from a fresco which the owners had forbidden anyone to copy, Granexi winked at Michelangelo and drawled beguilingly. "What a wonderful story, Michelangelo! Why did you never tell me?" Michelangelo smiled dryly. He could not call Doni a liar in public. What would it accomplish? Better to regard it as a measure of his success. As the months passed, he broke into 4 9-foot blocks simultaneously, creating advanced sculptural forms at one corner of each block, then tipping them over clockwise to work the other side. These were to be part of his captive theme for the tomb. Eager to define the muscular body forms, he measured the distances between anatomical areas and drove stubby bronze nails into the outer marble. He walked around the columns with a point in his hand, making chips here and there, nicking the planes to familiarize himself with the density of the stone. When he started the detail work on any one section, he would know how much marble lay behind it. Only with the hammer and point could he grasp the ulterior weight, the depth he could bite into. He knew in his carver's eye the details of the sculptures. In his mind they were not 4 separate figures but parts of a unified conception, the somnolent young giant, trying to free himself from his imprisonment in the stone of time, the awakening giant, bursting forth from his mountain chrysalis, the Atlas, full in years and power and wisdom, holding God's earth on his shoulders, and the bearded giant, old and tired, ready to pass the world along to the young giant in a continuing cycle of birth and death. He too lived as far outside the realm of time and space as these demigods, twisting and spiraling their tortured way out of their encasing blocks. He carved tirelessly through the autumnal and winter days, kept warm by a log fire, eating a little soup or veal when Monna Margherita carried it through the streets in a pot for him, throwing himself on the bed fully clothed when he could no longer follow the tracks of his punch or claw chisel. He awakened after a couple of hours refreshed, put a candle in his cap and continued to work, hewing the fronts of his figures, drilling holes between the legs, modeling the four bodies with pointed chisels, keeping them at the same stage of development. By spring the four captive giants were viable. Though the young giant's body was still embedded in the marble womb from which he was emerging, his feet unformed, and only the outlines of the features suggested in a head shielded beneath the upraised arm, the body lived by its own anatomical weight, the blood coursing through it. The Atlas, his head totally encased in a rough-hewn, overhanging cliff-like boulder held up by his gigantic arms, was pulsatingly alive, feeling intensely the bulk of the world he held. The bearded giant, his back and buttocks cross-hatched, leaned heavily against a base step scarred by the vicious pounding of the point. The awakening giant's head pushed forcibly to one side, his arms thrown out in an encircling movement, one leg bent violently at the knee, the other still buried in the block. He stood among his giants, the 9-foot blocks dwarfing him. Yet all four bowed beneath his superior force, his driving power, the flying hammer and chisel which were creating four pagan gods to hold up the tomb of a Christian pontiff. Granex, I cried. You've already made up the 3 lost years in the quarries. But where do they come from, these mysterious creatures? Are they Olympians from ancient Greece? Or prophets from the Old Testament? Every work of art is a self-portrait. They have a tremendous emotional impact. It's as though I must project myself into their unfinished forms, complete them by my own thinking and feeling. If Granex, I did not mean to suggest that Michelangelo leave his 4 captives unfinished, Pope Leo and Cardinal Giulio did. They decided to build a sacristy onto San Lorenzo in which to bury their fathers, Il Magnifico and his brother Giuliano. The walls of this new sacristy had been started on 2 earlier occasions. Michelangelo passed the masons without looking up at them, for he had no intention of getting himself involved in another stillborn Medici scheme. Unembarrassed by the fact that they had cancelled his contract for the facade, Pope Leo and Cardinal Giulio, who was back at the Vatican after having left the Cardinal of Cortona in charge of Florence, sent Salviati to Michelangelo with an offer to make sculptures for the new Capella. I am no longer their sculptor, cried Michelangelo when Salviati appeared at his door. Baccio Bandini now holds that exalted position. By the end of the year one will have these 4 captives out of their blocks. Another 2 years of such work and it can complete Julius' tomb, assemble it, be done with the contract. The Rovere family will owe me some 8,500 ducats. Do you know what that means to a man who has not turned a scudo for 4 years? You need the goodwill of the Medici. I also need money, which I don't get from the Medici. They still think of me as a 15-year-old who has left 3 florins each week on the wash stand for spending money. As the walls of the sacristy rose, so did the Medici pressure on him. The next overture came in a letter from Sebastiano in Rome. Michelangelo went on carving his giants, the twisted tension-packed thigh and knee of the young giant, the squat trunk like legs held in bondage by thongs, the expression turned inward. These were the realities of his life during the late spring days, the still, hot summer, the first cool breezes down from the mountains in September. When his brother Buonarrotti, now the father of a second son who was named Leonardo, walked over to the studio to complain that they had not seen him, and asked if he didn't get lonely working night and day without family or friends, he replied, "The giants are my friends. They talk not only to me but to each other. In debate. Like the Athenians used to carry on in their agora. Who wins? You, I hope. Dio mio, no. Sometimes they conspire, and overwhelm me. They're so enormous, Michelangelo. If any one of them should drop his arm on your head, it would break open like an egg. But there is no violence in them, they are victims, not aggressors, trying to hold up the world rather than tear it down." Why did he accede? He was not sure. By October the pressure from the Vatican had become intense. By October Buonarrotti's accounts showed that he had spent more cash in the past year than he had taken in rents from the properties in the Via Ghibellina, and from the sale of the wine, oil, barley, wheat, oats, sorghum and straw of his farms. By October he had poured out his strength so prodigiously on the 9-foot captives that he was vulnerable. The news of Raphael's death had shocked him, made him aware of man's short span, the limited time for creativity. He became sad, thoughtful. The memory of Il Magnifico and his untimely death returned to haunt him. What would I have been without Lorenzo de' Medici? He asked himself. And what have I yet done to repay him? Would it not be ungrateful of me to refuse to carve his tomb? Although he again would be saddled with tomb sculptures, he could demand the freedom to carve some highly imaginative pieces, ideas for which began to catch fire in his mind like the autumn burning of the shepherd's paleri in the mountains above Carrara. The final impetus was provided by Pope Leo's open expression of hostility. Sebastiano, striving desperately to get the commission to paint the Hall of Constantino in the Vatican, assured the Pope he could do wonders with the frescoes if only he had Michelangelo's help. Leo cried, "I do not doubt it, for you all belong to his school. Look at Raphael's work. As soon as he saw Michelangelo's, he left Perugino's style. But Michelangelo has a terribilità, and listens to no reason." Sebastiano wrote, "I said you were only so because you had important works to finish. You frighten everybody, including popes." This was the second pontiff in a row who had accused him of having an awesomeness. Even if it were true, who but they had been the cause of it? When he wrote to Sebastiano to complain, Sebastiano replied soothingly, "I do not esteem you terrible, except only in art, that is to say, in being the greatest master who ever lived." Soon he would complete enough of the figures for Julius' tomb to satisfy the rovers. Where did he go from there? He could not afford to be in disfavor at the Vatican. It controlled all the churches in Italy, even the nobles and rich merchants would heed its voice. Florence was also governed by the Medici. Either he worked for the Medici, or he might not work at all. He reassured himself with the fact that since the walls of the new sacristy were almost completed, the small, intimate chapel would be a limiting force, restricting the number of sculptures he might envisage. Jacopo Galli would approve of the scope of this commission. Pope Leo and Cardinal Giulio were happy to have him back in the family. Ill feelings over the Pietrocenta quarries and road were forgotten, perhaps because the crews from the Duomo workyard had been unable to get out any additional marble. The quarries were shut down. His 5 white columns lay neglected on the beach. Salviati, on his way to Rome on papal business, offered his services in setting up a workable agreement. "If such a thing is possible," exclaimed Michelangelo resignedly, "tell the Pope and the Cardinal that I will work for them on contract, by the month, by the day, or even as a gift." Early the next morning he went to the new sacristy, entering through a workman's portal. The interior walls were of rough cement. The dome had not yet been added. He thought how delightful it might look if he designed the interior of Beatrice Arena from the quarry in Maiano. He could pick the most luminous slabs, convert the cramped chapel into a shrine of white marble against blue-gray Beatrice Arena, the two materials he loved best in the world. Florence was flooded by wind-driven rains. He moved his work table to the front of the fire and drew exploratory plans. The Pope had now decided that there must also be tombs for the younger Medici, his brother Giuliano, and Piero's son Lorenzo. Michelangelo's first idea of a freestanding tomb with 4 sepulchres in the center of the chapel was declined by Cardinal Giulio on the grounds that the chapel was too small to hold the tombs and sculptures as well. The cardinal's idea of a series of arches with a tomb in the walls above each arch, his own sarcophagus to be in the center, was rejected by Michelangelo as unworkable. He drew a new concept. One austere sarcophagus on either side of the chapel, each holding 2 reclining allegorical figures, night and day on one, dawn and dusk on the other, 2 male, 2 female, great brooding figures of intense emotional and physical beauty, which would represent man's cycle within the days of his life. This plan was accepted. He thought of his 5 white columns on the beach of Pietrasanta. But they belonged to the Duomo. Simpler to send the 200 ducats advanced by the Vatican to his favorite quarry, the Polvaccio in Carrara, providing detailed drawings for their size and massing. When the blocks arrived, he was gratified to find that they were of high statuary quality and had been accurately dressed. He spent the spring and summer months designing the interior walls and dome, drawing for the night and day, dawn and dusk, the 2 life-size figures of the young Medici for the niches above the sarcophagi, a Madonna and Child for the wall opposite the altar. Cardinal Giulio came through Florence on his way to Lombardy to join the Pope's army, once again fighting the invading French. He sent for Michelangelo, received him warmly in the Medici palace. "Michelangelo, how can I see with my eyes and touch with my hands the exact chapel as you will finish it? Your Grace, I will give you actual drawings of the Beatrice Arena doors, windows, pilasters, columns, niches, cornices. Then I will build models in wood exactly the size the tombs are to be. I will put on them the proposed statues in clay, made to size and finished exactly as they are to be. That will take considerable time. The Holy Father is in a hurry." "No, Your Grace, it will take only a short time and cost little. Then it's settled. I will leave with Buonarroti in order to give you the money as it is needed." The cardinal did no such thing, but this neither surprised nor diverted Michelangelo. He proceeded to make the models at his own expense. He then turned his attention to the architecture, making sketches and building plans for the dome. He also decided to close in a number of the windows. The only time he stopped work was to celebrate the birth of Buonarroti's 3rd son, Buonarrotino, with 3 male heirs. The name of Buonarroti Simone was now secure. In late November, Pope Leo returned from a hunt at his villa at La Magliana and Cottage Hill. By December 1, 1521, the first Medici Pope was dead in the Vatican. Michelangelo attended the Requiem Mass in the Duomo, standing next to Granexite, remembering his years with Giovanni in the palace and Giovanni's first big hunt, Giovanni's kindness and loyalty when he had become an influential cardinal in Rome. He joined in the prayer for Leo's soul. Later, he whispered to Granexite, "Do you suppose that heaven can offer any part of the entertainment Leo provided himself at the Vatican? I doubt it. God would not spend that much money." The tramontana blew icily through the streets. No amount of logs could heat the studio. With Leo dead, the project of the Medici chapel became equally cold and windswept. In Rome, 6 factions of the College of Cardinals fought for supremacy, until they finally compromised on 62-year-old Adrian of Utrecht, a practical-minded Fleming who had been tutor to Charles V. Cardinal Giulio half fled to Florence, for Pope Adrian was a highly moral churchman who had disapproved of the Medici pontificate and knew Giulio to be responsible for a considerable portion of it. Pope Adrian set out to right the wrongs of Pope Leo and to redress the grievances of all who had been injured. He started by returning sovereignty to the Duke of Urbino, ended by listening sympathetically to the complaints of the Rovere family, agreeing that they should file suit against Michelangelo Buonarrotti for failure to fulfill his contract with Pope Julius Ayres. Michelangelo found himself twitching nervously as he walked through the streets to the house of Raffaele Ubaldini, a notary. Ubaldini had just returned from an audience with Pope Adrian. "Why should they want to take me into court?" Michelangelo cried. "I haven't abandoned the tomb." Ubaldini was an intense, serious little fellow with a blue skin where he shaved. "The Rovers claim you have. There are 4 captives in my studio. In your revised contract you agreed to complete the tomb last May. You agreed not to take any new projects, yet you accepted the Medici sacristy. I have only made drawings for the sacristy. Given another year. The Duke of Urbino has no more faith in your promises. They showed Pope Adrian that it is 17 years since you made the agreement, and yet you have delivered nothing." Quivering with rage, Michelangelo protested, "Did they tell Pope Adrian that it was Julius who stopped me originally by refusing to finance the tomb? By wasting 15 months of my life forcing me to do his figure in bronze in Bologna? That Julius stuck me in the Sistine vault for 4 years of painting. Piano, piano, gently, gently. Here, sit down at my desk." Michelangelo asked hoarsely. "If Pope Adrian favors their suit, I am defeated." "Probably. What will they want of me?" "First, all their money to be returned." "I'll return it. Over 8,000 ducats." 8,000. He sprang up as though a fire had been started beneath the leather chair. "But I've only had 3,000. They have documents, receipts." Ubaldini showed Michelangelo the accounting. Michelangelo went green. "The 2,000 ducats Julius paid me before he died was for the Sistine. Can you prove that?" "No." "Then the court will grant them 8,000 ducats, plus interest on the money over all these years." "How much will that be?" "Not more than 20%. They are also asking monetary damages for your failure to fulfill the contract. That can be any amount the court sees fit to levy. Pope Adrian has no interest in art, he considers this purely a business matter." Michelangelo blinked hard to force the tears back under his lids. "What am I to do?" he whispered. "All of my farms and houses put together are hardly worth 10,000 florins. I'll be bankrupt, my life savings swept away. Frankly, I don't know. We have to find friends at court. People who admire your work and will intervene with Pope Adrian. In the meanwhile, may I suggest that you complete your 4 captives and take them to Rome? If you would assemble as much of Julius' tomb as you already have carved." He returned blindly to his studio, his body pervaded with nausea. News spread over Florence of the catastrophe hanging over him. Friends began arriving, Granaxi and Rustici carrying purses of gold, members of the Strai and Pitti families offering to go to Rome in his behalf. He was trapped. The Rovers did not about the money, they were out to punish him for abandoning the Rovere tomb in favor of a Medici facade and chapel. When he wrote to Sebastiano offering to come to Rome and complete the tomb, the Duke of Urbino rejected his offer, declaring, "We no longer want the tomb. We want Buonarrotti brought into court and judgment passed on him." And he learned that there were degrees of being ruined. 3 years before, When Cardinal Giulio had recalled him from Pietrasanta and cancelled the facade, he had been seriously hurt, but he had been able to return to work, to carve the risen Christ and begin the four captives. Now he faced genuine disaster. 47 years old, he would be stripped of his possessions and publicly discredited as a person unable or unwilling to complete a commission. The rovers would brand him as a thief for taking their money and giving nothing in return. There would be no work for him as long as Adrian was pope. As an artist and a man, his life was behind him. He wandered the countryside talking to himself, conjuring up conspiracies against him, the intrigues and machinations of blind fate, often not knowing where he was as his mind veered from one fantasy to another. Flight to Turkey with his friend Tommaso di Tolfo, who had invited him a second time, escaped from Italy in disguise to take up life at the French court under another name, revenge against those who had injured him, diatribes about his tormentors, with visions of doing them violence, all the mental aberrations of the sorely afflicted. He was unable to sleep at night, to sit at table during a meal. His legs moved him to Pistoria or Pontassieve, while his mind was in Rome or Urbino or Carrara or Florence, quarreling, accusing, shouting, hitting, unable to absorb the injustices and indignities. He watched the harvests being taken in, the wheat flailed on cobbled farm courtyards, the grapes brought from the vines and squeezed for wine, the hay shaped into ricks and covered for the winter, the olives picked and trees cut back. The trees began to turn yellow. He became emaciated, could hold down no more food than during his nights of dissection at Santo Spirito. He asked himself over and over again, how could it have happened? When I started out so full of love for marble, so consumed to carve, to work at my craft. When I have never wanted anything else in this world. What has happened to me? How have I become displaced? What has been my crime, O Lord? He cried aloud. Why hast thou forsaken me? How can I be going through Dante's Inferno if I am not yet dead? As he read the Inferno, he came across passages that made him feel that Dante had written the book to describe his, Michelangelo's, life and lot. Am I a thief, to be tortured by serpents? Must I be part of that wretched crowd? Each one seemed to be most strangely twisted. Between the chin and where the chest begins, the face of everyone turned to his back. So ever backward they were forced to walk. I had come among that wretched crew, which God and all his foes abominate. These abject cowards who had never lived, were naked, and were stung incessantly by monstrous flies and wasps that swarmed about them. He stayed off the streets during the day, away from the populous piazzas with their noisy, colorful markets and fairs, for it was just as when he had been painting the Sistine ceiling and walked home through the Piazza San Pietro. People seemed to look straight through him as though he were not there. He had the eerie feeling that he was moving like a ghost among the living. He sought out Ecstasy, demanding, what is it that I lack? I have been affiliated with popes, given stupendous commissions. I have talent, energy, enthusiasm, self-discipline, singleness of purpose. What am I missing? Fortuna, luck. Where does one search for the leaven of luck? Last out the bad times, caro, then you will be alive to enjoy the good. If you burn yourself out, like a rotted tree trunk set on fire. Ah, Ecstasy, your favorite word, survival. What if one's work is done? How old is your father? Lodovico? Almost 80. You see, your life is only half spent. So your work is only half done. You just don't have enough faith. Ecstasy proved to be right. God alone rescued him. After 22 agonizing months he gathered Pope Adrian to his everlasting reward. In the College of Cardinals there followed 7 weeks of bargaining, dealing, promises and commitments, until Cardinal Giulio de' Medici garnered enough votes to get himself elected. Cousin Giulio. Pope Clement VII sent word immediately after his coronation, Michelangelo must resume work on the chapel. He was like a man who has been through a dangerous illness and has gazed into the visage of death. From this vantage point he came to a realization that everything that had happened to him before this had been a journey upward through time, everything that occurred after it a descent. If he could not control his own fate, why be born? The god of the Sistine vault, about to hand on to Adam the spark of life, had implicit in his glorious being the promise of freedom to accompany that life. He began to carve his allegories for the sacristy as creatures who had experienced the hardship and tragedy of life, who knew its wastefulness, its futility. The contadini said, life is to be lived. Granexi said, life is to be enjoyed. Michelangelo said, life is to be worked. Dawn, Des, dusk and night said, life is to be suffered. His David had been young, knowing he could conquer everything he set out after. Moses was ripe in years, but with the inner strength to move mountains and form nations. These new creatures of his making had an aura of sadness about them, of pity. They were asking the most painful and unanswerable of dilemmas: for what purpose are we put on earth? To live our cycle? To perpetuate it? A continuous chain of living flesh, binding the burden of one generation to another? Before, his concern had been with the marble and what he could extract from it. Now his concern shifted to human emotion and what he could portray of the philosophic meaning of life. He had been a man with marble. Now he achieved an identity of man and marble. He had always wanted his figures to represent something important, but his David, his Moses, his Pietà, all had been solitary pieces, complete within themselves. In this Medici chapel he had an opportunity to portray a unified theme. What his mind evoked about the meaning of the carvings would be more important than the movements of his sculptor's hands over the marble surfaces. On March 6, 1525, Lodovico gave a dinner at the family home to celebrate Michelangelo's 50th birthday. Michelangelo awakened in a melancholy mood, but as he sat down at the table, surrounded by Lodovico, by Buonarroti, his wife and 4 children, by his brothers Giovansimone and Sigismondo, he was content. He had come into the autumn of his life. A man had his seasons, even as had the earth. Was the harvesting of autumn less important than the seeding of spring? Each without the other was meaningless. He drew, modelled and carved like a man released from prison, to whom the only remaining joy was the freedom to project himself in space. Time was his quarry. From it he would excavate the pure white crystalline years. What else was there to mine in the craggy mountains of the future? Money? It had eluded him. Fame? It had entrapped him. Work was its own reward, there was no other. To create in white marble more glorious figures than had ever been seen on earth or in heaven, to express through them universal truths, this was the payment, the glory of the artist. All else was illusion, vanishing smoke on the horizon. Pope Clement put him on a lifetime pension of 50 ducats a month, assigned him a house across the piazza from the church of San Lorenzo as a workshop. The Duke of Urbino and the other Ovier heirs were persuaded to drop their lawsuit. He was now to design a single-wall tomb for which he had all the figures except the Pope and Virgin already carved. It had taken him a full 20 years to reach the practical conclusion about Julius' tomb, which Jacopo Galli had known from the beginning. For the sacristy he contracted with the Topolino family to handle the cutting and installing of the Pietra Serena doors, windows, Corinthian columns and architraves which divided the chapel walls into 3 levels, the giant pilasters of the lower level giving way to the delicate fluted columns and slender niches of the second, the lunettes and pendentives of the third supporting the dome. What he tried to achieve in his dome was a combination of the man-made form of a Duomo and the bulbous form of the ripe fruit all about him. It was somewhat compacted because it had to be set onto walls already erected, but he enjoyed finding out that there was as much sculpture in architecture as there was architecture in sculpture. Orders and commissions began coming in, everything from windows for palaces to a tomb for Bologna, a villa for Mantua, a statue of Andrea Doria for Genoa, a palace facade for Rome, a Virgin with Archangel Michael for San Miniato. Even Pope Clement offered him a new commission, this time a library to house the Medici manuscripts and books, to be built above the old sacristy of San Lorenzo. He drew some rough plans for the library, again using Pietra Serena for the decorative effects. His new young apprentice was Antonio Mini, a nephew of his friend Giovan Battista Mini, a long-faced lad with eyes and mouth too round for his thin cheeks, but with a well-modeled bone structure and a serene attitude toward life. He was honest and reliable in delivering models, copying drawings, making and repairing chisels in the forge, as loyal and delightful a helper as Argento had been, but with considerably more talent. Since Michelangelo now had a woman servant, Monna Agniola, to do the housekeeping in the Via Mazza studio, the romantic Mini was free to spend his spare hours on the Duomo steps with the young boys of the town, watching the girls parade past the baptistry in their high-neck dresses and puffed sleeves. Giovanni Spina, merchant scholar of the noble line of Jacopo Galli, Aldo Grandi and Salviati, was named by Pope Clement to handle Michelangelo, the sacristy and Medici library. He was a rangy man, stoop-shouldered, cold even in mild weather, with an intelligent face, and eyes that were not wide but very long. He introduced himself at the studio door by saying, "I met Sebastiano at court in Rome. He admitted me to your house in the Macello de Corvi to see the Moses and the two young captives. I have always worshipped Donatello's work. You are like father and son. Grandfather and son. I was the heir of Bertoldo, who was the heir of Donatello. We are a continuous Tuscan bloodline." Spina smoothed the hair which he combed downward over his ears. "When the Pope has no funds in Florence, you can count on me to get them from somewhere." He approached the four unfinished captives, circling, weaving in and out, studying, eyes open to their full length in astonishment. This Atlas, holding on his shoulders the top of the block where his head will eventually emerge. Is he saying that every man who carries a head on his shoulders is carrying the full weight of the world? They sat on the workbench discussing the deliquesces in Bologna and the Laocoon in Rome. Spina asked, "The Russelli don't acknowledge that you are a cousin, do they?" "How did you know?" "I checked the records." "Will you come to their palace gardens for our meeting? We are all that's left of the Plato Academy. This Thursday Niccolo Machiavelli is reading the first chapter of his History of Florence, which the Signoria commissioned. Inside the unfinished sacristy he worked on the blocks of Dawn, Dusk, the Virgin and young Lorenzo. During the warm fall evenings he sat by the open doors to his yard, making clay models for the river gods, symbolic of tears and suffering, for the baths of the young Medici figures. Later, tired from carving or fashioning clay, but without desire for sleep, he lay wide-eyed hearing the surrounding church bells toll off the hours toward dawn. He saw Contessina's piquant face before him, heard the timbre of her voice, and at the same time felt Clarissa lying by his side, his arms twined tightly about her to hold her close to him. Somehow, after the years of lovelessness, the two images merging until they became one, the figure of love itself. He wondered if he would ever know love again, in whatever form or guise. He rose, took sheets of drawing papers covered with cross-hatched studies for dawn and dusk, arms, hips, breasts, legs, and spent the rest of the night pouring out his feelings in poetry. Love's furnace. So friendly is the fire to flinty stone, that, struck therefrom and kindled to a blaze, it burns the stone, and from the ash doth raise. What lives thenceforward binding stones in one? Kiln hardened this resists both frost and sun, acquiring higher worth for endless days, as the purged soul from hell returns with praise. E'en so the fire struck from my soul, that late, close hidden in my heart, may temper me, till burned and slaked the better life fire eyes. If made mere smoke and dust, I live today. Fire hardened I shall live eternally. Such gold, not iron, my spirit strikes and tries. With the first light he put away the papers, walked to the mirror over his washstand and studied his visage as though it belonged to characterful model he had hired to pose for him. His entire physiognomy appeared to have deepened, the lines across his flat forehead, the eyes retreating from the world under the bony brows, the nose, which now appeared to be wider than ever, the lips pulled tight as though to lock in word and thought. The eyes were darkly amber. Only his hair had resisted change, remaining rich in color and texture, curling youthfully across his forehead. With the return of a Medici as Pope, Baccio Bandinelli was given the commission to carve the Hercules for the front of the Signoria, the one Michelangelo had been offered by Gonfaloni Soderini some 17 years before. Knowing that Michelangelo had been upset, many ran all the way home, burst into the studio crying. The block for the Hercules just arrived, and sank in the Arno. People standing on the bank are saying that the marble tried to drown itself rather than be carved by Bandinelli. Michelangelo laughed heartily, picked up his chisel and made a long go from the bony knee of the crepusculo, dusk, to the groin. The next morning a canon from Rome brought him a message from Pope Clement. Buonarrotti, you know the corner of the loggia of the Medici garden, opposite where Luigi della Sciaffa lives? The Pope asked if you would like to erect a colossus there, 80 feet high. A marvelous idea, Michelangelo replied sarcastically, only it might take up too much of the roadway. Why not put it in the corner where the barbershop stands? We could make the statue hollow inside and rent out the ground floor to the barber. In that way his rent would not be lost. He went of a Thursday evening to the Rucellai Palace to hear Machiavelli read his Mandragola. The feeling of the group against Pope Clement was bitter. He was referred to as the mule, bastard, the dregs of the Medici. The Plato Academy was at the center of the plot to restore the Republic. Their hatred was intensified by the fact that the two illegitimate Medici were living in the palace, being groomed to take over the government of Florence. That would be the bottom of the trough for us, commented Stroi, about Clement's son, to be governed by the mule of a mule. Michelangelo heard stories of how Clement was strengthening the cause of the anti-Medici party by making fatal errors of judgment, even as Leo had. In the incessant wars among the surrounding nations he consistently backed the wrong side. His allies, the French, had their armies destroyed by the Holy Roman Emperor, whose overtures Clement had rejected. Though, truth to tell, Clement changed sides so often that neither Michelangelo nor Europe could keep up with his intrigues. In Germany and Holland thousands of Catholics were abandoning their religion for the Reformation which Pope Clement refused to carry out within the Church, and which Martin Luther's 95 Theses nailed to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg in 1517 had enunciated. I am in an awkward position, Michelangelo told Spina as they sat over a supper of roast pigeons served by Monna Agniola. I long for the return of the Republic, but I am working for the Medici. The whole fate of the sacristy depends on the goodwill of Pope Clement. If I join a movement to drive out the Medici, what happens to the sculptures? "Art is the highest expression of freedom," replied Giovanni Spina. "Let the others fight over politics." Michelangelo locked himself inside the sacristy, burying his head in marble. But Cardinal Passerini of Cortona ruled Florence autocratically. A foreigner, he had no love for Florence, nor did Clement seem to have any, for he rejected all appeals from the Signoria and the old families to replace the man whom the Florentines found crude, greedy, contemptuous of their elected councils, bleeding them with excessive taxes. The Florentines were waiting only for an advantageous moment to rise, seize the necessary arms and once again drive the Medici out of the city. When the army of the Holy Roman Empire, sweeping southward to invade Rome and punish Pope Clement, marched 30,000 strong on Bologna, after which it planned to conquer Florence, the city rose in a mass, stormed the Medici palace and demanded arms to defend itself against the coming invasion, shouting, "Guns! Guns to the people!" The Cardinal of Cortona appeared in an upper window and promised arms. But when the Cardinal learned that the Pope's army, commanded by Michelangelo's erstwhile opponent, the Duke of Urbino, was approaching Florence, he ignored his promise and rushed out with the two young Medici boys to meet the Duke. Now Michelangelo joined Granexi and his friends at the Palazzo della Signoria. In the piazza crowds were calling, "Popolo, libertà!" The people, liberty! Florentine soldiers guarding the Signoria made no attempt to prevent a committee of citizens from entering the government palace. A meeting was held in the Great Hall. Then Niccolò Caponi, whose father had led the earlier movement to drive out Piero de' Medici, stepped onto a balcony and announced, "The Florentine Republic is re-established. The Medici are banished. All citizens are to be armed and summoned to the Piazza della Signoria." Cardinal Passerini arrived with 1,000 of the Duke of Urbino's cavalry. The Medici party opened a gate for them. The committee inside the palace bolted the doors. Urbino's cavalry attacked the doors with long pikes. From the 2 stories of windows, and from the crenellated parapet above, there rained down on the Duke's soldiers everything that could be pried loose inside the building: desks, tables, chairs, crockery, armor. A heavy wooden bench came hurtling down from the parapet. Michelangelo saw that it was headed straight for the David. "Look out!" he screamed, as though the statue might dodge. He was too late. The wooden bench struck. The left arm holding the slingshot snapped off below the elbow. The arm fell to the stone of the piazza, broke. The crowd drew back. The soldiers turned to stare. All movement from the windows and parapet of the Signoria Palace stopped. A hush fell over the throng. He felt himself moving toward the sculpture. The crowd opened, murmuring, "It is Michelangelo. Let him pass." He stood below the David, gazing up into the pensive, resolute yet beautiful face. Goliath had not scratched him, but the civil war inside Florence had come within inches of destroying him completely. Michelangelo's arm ached, as though it too had been amputated. Out of the crowd Giorgio Vasari, one of Michelangelo's young apprentices, and Secchino Rossi sped toward the David, picked up the 3 marble fragments of the arm and hand and disappeared down the narrow side street. In the stillness of the night there was a tattooing of finger ends on Michelangelo's door. He opened it to admit Vasari and Secchino. They began talking at once. "Signor Buonarrotti, we have the 3 pieces hidden in a chest in Rossi's father's house. They are safe." Michelangelo gazed at the 2 shining young faces before him, thinking, safe? What was safe in a world of war and chaos? The Holy Roman Emperor's army reached Rome, breached the walls. The horde of mixed mercenaries overran Rome. forcing Pope Clement to flee along the high passageway to the fortress of Sant'Angelo, where he remained a prisoner while the German, Spanish and Italian troops looted, ravaged and burned Rome, destroying sacred works of art, smashing altars, marble statues of Mary, the prophets and saints, melting bronze figures for cannon, stained glass windows for lead, lighting fires on the inlaid marble floors of the Vatican, putting out the eyes in paintings, dragging a statue of Pope Clement into the street and hacking it to pieces. "What of my Pietà? My Sistine ceiling?" groaned Michelangelo. "What of my studio? The Moses and the two slaves? They can be lying in 1,000 pieces." Spina arrived late at night. He had been to a series of feverish meetings at the Medici Palace, and then at the Signoria Palace. With the exception of a core of die-hard Medici adherents, all Florentines were agreed that the Medici must be deprived of their power. With Pope Clement a prisoner, the Republic could once again be proclaimed. Ippolito, Alessandro and the Cardinal of Cortona would be allowed to leave peacefully. And that, concluded Spina thoughtfully, should be the end of Medici rule for a very long time. Michelangelo was silent. "The new sacristy?" Spina hung his head. "It must be locked. The Medici are my nemesis," he cried in agony. "All these years of work for Leo and Clement, and what have I to show for them? 6 hewn blocks, the half-finished interior of a chapel. With Clement a prisoner, the rovers will descend on me again." He sat down hard on his workbench. Spina spoke softly. "I shall recommend you for an office of the Republic. Once our government is secure, we can persuade the Signoria that the chapel is for Il Magnifico, whom all Tuscans revere. Then we will get permission to unlock the doors and start work again." He boarded up the house across from San Lorenzo, with its drawings and clay models, returned to the Via Mazza and plunged abruptly into a block to define a Victory, one of the original concepts for Julius' tomb. It emerged as a classic Greek youth, well-proportioned though not as muscular as others he had carved. He worked well with his hands, the chisels plowing the pliant marble, but before long he realized that his head was not working at all. Victory? Over whom? Over what? If he did not know who was the victor, how could he determine who was the vanquished? Under the feet of the victor, defeated and crushed, he carved the face and head of an old man. Himself? As he might look 10 or 20 years from now, with his beard grown full and white. What had defeated him? Age? Was youth the victor, since it was the only period in which one could imagine that one could be a victor? The defeated one had experience, a deep knowing and suffering in his face, bent under the knee of the youth. Was that what happened to experience and wisdom? Was it always crushed and destroyed by time and the guise of youth? Outside his studio the Republic of Florence was triumphant. Niccolò Capone was elected Gonfaloniere to govern in the Soderini tradition. For its protection the city-state had adopted Machiavelli's revolutionary plan for a militia of citizens trained, armed and equipped to defend the Republic against invaders. Florence was ruled not only by its Signoria but by a council of Edii, which represented the old families. Trade was active, the city prosperous, the people happy in their regained freedom. Few cared what happened to Pope Clement, still a prisoner in Sant'Angelo, defended by a few adherents, among them Benvenuto Cellini, the young sculptor who had refused to be apprenticed to Torrigiani. But Michelangelo was vitally interested in Pope Clement. He had put 4 years of loving work into the sacristy. There were partially finished blocks in the now locked and sealed chapel to whose future he was dedicated. He kept a close watch on Clement's fate. Pope Clement was in danger from 2 sides. The Church was being broken up into national units, with power drained away from Rome. It was not merely that the Lutherans were sweeping through mid-Europe. Cardinal Wolsey of England proposed a council of free cardinals in France to set up a new government for the Church. The Italian cardinals were meeting at Parma to establish their own hierarchy. The French cardinals were setting up papal vicars. Charles' German and Spanish troops quartered in Rome were still sacking, destroying, demanding ransom to get out. From Sant'Angelo, Clement tried to raise the money, forced to sacrifice hostages to the enemy. Jacopo Salviati was dragged through the streets to the gallows and almost hanged. The months went by, intrigue grew in every country for a new distribution of power, for a new pope, a council, a reformation. At the end of the year of our Lord 1527 the tide turned. A virulent plague decimated the Holy Roman Emperor's armies. The German troops hated Rome, were desperately anxious to return home. A French army invaded Italy to fight the Holy Roman Empire. Clement agreed to pay the invaders 300,000 ducats within 3 months. The Spanish army was withdrawn from the Baths of Sant'Angelo. And after 7 months of incarceration Pope Clement fled, disguised as a merchant, making his way to Orvieto. Michelangelo promptly received a communication from Clement. Was Michelangelo still working for him? Would he continue to sculpture in the new sacristy? If so, Pope Clement had 500 ducats on hand which he would send to him by messenger to cover the immediate costs. Michelangelo was deeply moved. The sorely harassed Pope, without funds or followers or prospects of regaining power, had sent words of affection and continued trust, as he would have to any other member of his family. "I can take Giulio's money," Michelangelo said to Spina as they conferred in the Via Mazza studio, "but couldn't I carve sometimes? If I slipped in unseen, at night? It could not hurt Florence." Patience. In a year or two. The Council of Viti is apprehensive about what Clement may do. They would consider your working on the chapel an act of disloyalty. With warm weather, the plague struck Florence. People came down with crushing headaches, pain in the back and limbs, fever, vomiting, and in 3 days were dead. If they dropped in the streets they were left there, if they died in their houses their families fled. Thousands of Florentines perished. The city became a morgue. Buonarroti summoned his brother to the house on the Via Ghibellina. "Michelangelo, I'm frightened for Bartolomeo and the children. Could I move up to our house in Sant'Agnano? We'd be safe there." "Certainly. Take father with you." "I won't go," growled Lodovico. "When a man is in his mid-80s he has the right to die in his own bed." Fate was waiting for Buonarroti at Sant'Agnano, in the room where he had been born. By the time Michelangelo reached there Buonarroti was delirious, his tongue was swollen and covered with a dry yellowish fuzz. Giovan Simone had moved Buonarroti's wife and children to safety the day before. The servants and contadini had fled. Michelangelo drew a chair up to his brother's bed, thinking how much alike they still looked. Buonarroti's eyes lighted in alarm at the sight of his brother. "Michelangelo, don't stay. The plague." Michelangelo wet his brother's parched lips with a damp cloth, murmured, "I will not leave you. You're the only member of our family who has loved me. I always loved you. But I've been a burden. Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive, Buonarroti. Had I kept you by my side all during the years I would have been much better off." Buonarroti managed a weary smile. "Michelangelo, you always were good." By sundown Buonarroti was dying. Michelangelo encircled him with his left arm, his brother's head resting on his chest. Buonarroti woke only once, saw Michelangelo's face held close to his own. The pain-caused furrows eased, resignation spread its calm unguent. In a few moments he was dead. Michelangelo carried his brother in a blanket to the graveyard behind the church. There were no coffins, no diggers. He dug a grave, lowered Buonarroti into the hole, summoned the priest, waited until Buonarroti had been sprinkled with holy water and blessed, then he shoveled earth into the grave, filled it. He returned to the Via Mozza, burnt his clothes in the backyard, scrubbed himself in his wooden tub in water hot as he could stand. He did not know whether this helped against the plague, nor did he greatly doubt. Word was brought to him that Simone, his oldest nephew, was also dead of the plague. Michelangelo thought, perhaps Buonarroti was the fortunate one. If he had caught the disease, he had but a few hours to put his affairs in order. He drew up a paper paying back to Buonarroti's wife the dowry she had brought with her, a young woman. She would need it to get a second husband. He arranged for his 11-year-old niece, Secca, to be put into the convent of Boldrone, providing for her keep and education by assigning produce from 2 of his farms. He set aside assets to pay for the education of his nephews Leonardo and little Buonarrotino. When Granexi banged on the locked door, Michelangelo cried, "Go away. I've been exposed to the plague. I may have caught it. Don't be sicko, silly. You're too crusty to die. Open up, I've got a bottle of wine to ward off evil spirits. Granexi, go home and drink by yourself. I'm not going to be the cause of killing you. Maybe if you stay alive you'll paint one more good picture." "Now isn't that an inducement?" laughed Granexi. "Allora, if you're still alive tomorrow, come finish your half of the Chianti." The plague abated. People filtered down from the surrounding hills. Shops reopened. The Signoria returned to the city. One of its first resolutions was to commission Michelangelo Buonarrotti to carve the Hercules which Soderini had ordered 20 years before, out of the block that Bandini had massed up to its navel. Once again Pope Clement interfered. Having returned to the Vatican by making an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor, he resumed power over the renegade Italian, French and English cardinals, formed an army out of the forces of the Duke of Urbino, the Colonna and Spanish troops. This army was being sent against independent Florence to wipe out the Republic, punish the enemies of the Medici and once again restore the family to power. Spina had underestimated Pope Clement and the Medici. Michelangelo was summoned before the Signoria, where Gonfaloniere Caponi sat at Soderini's desk, surrounded by his 8 in office. "Since you're a sculptor, Buonarroti," he said in a rushing voice, "we assume you can also be a defense engineer. We need walls that cannot be breached. Since they are of stone, and you are a man of stone." Michelangelo gulped. Now he would really be involved on both sides. "Confine yourself to the south of the city. We are impregnable from the north. Report at the quickest possible moment." He explored along the several miles of wall that began on the east with the hillside church of San Miniato, and snaked its way westward before returning to the Arno. Neither the walls nor the fence towers were in a good state of repair, nor were there ditches on the outside to make the enemy approach more hazardous. Stones were loose, badly baked bricks were crumbling, more towers for cannon were needed, additional height to make scaling a longer task. The anchor of the defense line would have to be the Campanile of San Miniato, from whose height the defenders could command most of the ground over which the enemy troops would have to charge. He returned with his report to Gonfaloniere Caponi and the Signoria, laying out before them the number of stone masons, brickmakers, carters, peasants he would need to make the walls defensible. The Gonfaloniere cried impetuously, "Do not touch San Miniato. There is no need to fortify a church. There is every need, Excellency, for if we do not the enemy will not need to break down the walls. They will turn our flank here, east of the San Miniato hill." He was given permission to prove that his plan was the best one possible. He pressed everyone into service: Granexite, the company of the cauldron, the masons from the Duomo workyard, where before he had scoured the countryside seeking a figure, or face, a husky or more elongated sunburned throat for a statue or painting. Now he searched for stonemasons, quarriers from Aano and Prato, carpenters, brickmakers, mechanics, to stem the war. Work went ahead at full speed, for the Pope's army was reported moving on Florence from several directions, a formidable force of trained men and weapons. Michelangelo built a road up from the river for his men and supplies, began his bastions at the first tower outside the gate of San Miniato, towards San Giorgio, closing in the vital defense hill with high walls of brick made of pounded earth mixed with flax, orto, and cattle dung, 100 contadini working in teams, throwing up the walls as fast as they could get the bricks squared. The stonemasons cut, chipped, shaped, shoring up weak stretches, adding height to the walls and towers, erecting new areas at the more vulnerable spots. When the first phase of his work was completed, the Signoria made an inspection. The next morning when he entered the corner office overlooking the Piazza della Signoria and the tight-knit roofs of Florence, he was greeted with smiles. "Michelangelo, you have been elected to the Novella Militia, the Militia 9, as Governor General of the fortifications. It is a great honor, Gonfaloniere, and a greater responsibility. We want you to make an inspection trip to Pisa and Livorno, to make sure our defenses from the sea are secure." There was no further thought of sculpture. Nor could he cry, "War is not my trade." He had a specific job to do. Florence had called on him in its time of crisis. He had never imagined himself a commander, an organizer, but now he found that evolving intricate works of art had taught him how to coordinate each mounting detail to accomplish a finished result. He might even wish he had a little of Leonardo da Vinci's inventiveness with machines. On his return from Pisa and Livorno he began a series of ditches as deep as moats, using the excavated earth and rock to form a further series of barricades. His next move was to secure permission to level all buildings between the defense walls and base of the encircling foothills a mile to the south, terrain over which the papal army would have to attack. The militia used battering rams of the kind the ancients used, to knock down the farmhouses and village homes. The farmers helped to level houses that had been in their families for hundreds of years. The wealthy protested against the wrecking of their palaces, not without reason, Michelangelo acknowledged, since they were so beautifully built. Only a few of the soldiers could be induced to level the several small chapels. When he himself came to the refectory of San Salvi and saw Andrea del Sarto's Last Supper shining in all its brilliance on the half-raised walls, he cried out, "Let it be! It is too great a work of art to be destroyed." The leveling job was just finished when he received word that the Via Mazza studio had been broken into. Models were thrown to the floor, folios of drawings and sketches scattered in wild confusion, many missing, as well as 4 models in wax. He saw the glitter of metal on the floor. Leaning over, he picked up a chisel from among a pile of papers. It was the kind used in a goldsmith's shop. He walked to the home of his friend Pilotto, who knew the local goldsmiths. "Do you recognize this chisel?" "Yes. It belongs to Bandinelli." Very discreetly the sketches and wax models were returned. Michelangelo instructed Mini to see that the studio was kept guarded. The Signoria dispatched him to Ferrara to study the Duke of Ferrara's new fortifications. The note he carried with him read, "We send to Ferrara our celebrated Michelangelo Buonarrotti, as you are aware a man of rare endowments, for certain purposes which he will explain to you by word of mouth. We greatly desire that he should be recognized as a person highly esteemed by us and cherished as his merits deserve. the Duke of Ferrara, a cultivated man of the Este family, and an enthusiast of painting, sculpture, poetry, the theatre, urged him to be a guest at the palace. Michelangelo graciously declined, staying at an inn where he enjoyed an uproarious reunion with Argento, who brought in his 9 children to kiss Michelangelo's hand. "Well, Argento, have you become a good farmer?" Argento grimaced. "Number. But the earth makes things grow, no matter what I do to it. Children are my main crop. And mine is still troubled, Argento." When Michelangelo thanked the Duke of Ferrara for revealing his defense structures, the Duke said, "Make me a painting. Then I shall be rewarded." Michelangelo grinned. As soon as this war is over. Back in Florence he found that General Malatesta of Perugia had been brought to Florence to serve as one of the commanding generals. He quarreled immediately with Michelangelo's plan to throw up stone supports in the manner he had learned in Ferrara. "You have already burdened us with too many walls. Take your peasants away, and let my soldiers defend Florence." Malatesta seemed cold, devious. That night Michelangelo roamed the base of his ramparts. He came upon the 8 pieces of artillery that had been given to Malatesta to defend the San Miniato wall. Instead of being placed inside the fortifications, or on the parapets, they lay outside the walls, unguarded. Michelangelo awoke the sleeping general. "What do you mean by exposing your artillery pieces that way? We guarded them with our lives until you arrived. They could be stolen or destroyed by anyone who stumbled upon them." "Are you the commander of the Florentine army?" demanded Malatesta, livid. "Just of the defense walls." "Then go make your count on brick, and don't tell a soldier how to fight." Returning to San Miniato, Michelangelo encountered General Mario Orsini, who demanded, "What has gone wrong, my friend? Your face is on fire." Michelangelo told him. When he had finished, Orsini replied sadly, "You must know that the men of his house are all traitors. In time he will betray Florence. Have you reported this to the Signoria? I am a hired officer, like Malatesta, not a Florentine." In the morning Michelangelo waited in the great hall of the palace until he could be admitted to the Gonfalonier's office. The Signoria was not impressed. "Stop concerning yourself over our officers. Confine yourself to your new plans for the walls. They must not be breached. They won't need to be, with Malatesta guarding them. You are overwrought. Get some rest." He returned to the walls, continued to work under the boiling September sun, but he could not put Malatesta out of his mind. Everywhere he went he heard stories against the general. He had yielded Perugia without a battle. His men would not fight the Pope's troops at Arezzo. When the armies reached Florence, Malatesta would surrender the city. In his mind he went back time and again to the Signoria, pleading that Malatesta be removed, seeing his labors in building impregnable walls going for nothing as Malatesta opened the gates to the Pope's army. Or was it really to Gonfaloni or Caponi that he was protesting? Wasn't it to Pope Julius? About Roman's walls for St. Peter's, which were made of weak cement and would crumble? Had Malatesta demanded, "Are you the commander of the army?" Wasn't it Pope Julius who had asked, "Are you an architect?" He became agitated. He envisaged the Pope's troops destroying Florence even as Rome had been, sacking, pillaging, smashing the works of art. Sleepless, unable to eat or to concentrate on directing his stone crews, he began to overhear shards of sentences which convinced him that Malatesta had gathered the officers on the south wall in a conspiracy against Florence. He went 6 days and nights without rest or nourishment, unable to control his anxieties. One night a voice spoke to him. He whirled about on the parapet. Who are you? A friend. What do you want? To save your life. Is it in danger? Of the worst kind. The Pope's army? Malatesta. What is he going to do? Have you killed? Why? For exposing his treason. No one believes me. Your corpse will be found at the base of the bastion. I can protect myself. Not and dismissed. What should I do? Flee. That is treason. Better than being dead. When must I go? Now. I'm in charge here. You haven't a moment. How can I explain? Hurry. My command. The walls. Hurry. Hurry. He descended from the parapet, crossed the Arno, took a back route to the Via Mazza. Figures emerged from the thick fog half-formed, like massed marble blocks. He ordered Minnie to put clothes and money in their saddlebags. He and Minnie mounted their horses. At the Prato gate they were challenged. A guard cried, "It is Michelangelo, of the Militia 9. Let him by." He headed for Bologna, Ferrara, Venice, France. Safety. He was back after 7 weeks, humiliated and in disgrace. The Signoria fined him, and barred him from the council for 3 years. But because the papal armies were now camped 30,000 strong on the hills beyond his southern defense walls, they sent him back to his command. He had Granaxi to thank for his reprieve, when the Signoria outlawed him. Along with others who had taken flight, Granaxi had secured a temporary commutation for him and sent Bastiano, who had helped Michelangelo repair the walls, in pursuit. "I must say the Signoria was lenient," commented Granaxi sternly, "considering that you have returned a full 5 weeks after the Rebel Exclusion Act. You could have lost all your property in Tuscany, and your head too, as Ficino's grandson lost his life for stating that the Medici seemed more entitled to rule than anyone else, considering their contribution to the city. You had better take a blanket up to San Miniato and enough victuals for a year's siege." "Don't worry, Granaxi, I can't be that stupid twice." "What possessed you?" "I heard voices." "Whose?" "My own." Granaxi grinned. "I was helped by the rumors of your reception at the court in Venice, the offer from the Doge to design a bridge over the Rialto, and the French ambassador's efforts to get you to the French court. The Signoria thought you were an idiot, which you are, but a great artist, which you are. They weren't happy about your settling in Venice or Paris. Just thank your stars that you know how to chip marble, or you might never again have lived in sight of the Duomo." Michelangelo looked out the third-floor window of Granaxi's study to where Brunelleschi's glorious red tile dome stood in its spatial majesty against a stormy sunset. "The finest architectural form in the world is the bull of the sky," he mused, "and do you know, Brunelleschi's dome is equally beautiful." He settled his effects in the tower of San Miniato, gazed through the powdery light of a full moon at the hundreds of enemy tents with their pointed cones set up a mile away, beyond the ground he had cleared on the hills that formed a semicircle to enclose his protective line. He was awakened at dawn by artillery fire. As he had expected, the attack was concentrated against the tower of San Miniato. If it could be knocked down, the Pope's forces would pour into the city. 150 pieces of artillery fired steadily. Whole sections of brick and stone were blasted out by the exploding cannonballs. The attack lasted for 2 hours. When it was finished, Michelangelo let himself out by a tunnel and stood at the base of the bell tower, surveying the damage. He asked for volunteers among those who knew how to handle stone and cement. Bastiano directed the work inside. Michelangelo took a group outside and in full view of the papal troops refitted the fallen, shattered stone into the walls. For some reason beyond his comprehension, perhaps because they did not know how much damage they had inflicted, the enemy troops remained in camp. He ordered his carters to bring in Arno sand and sacks of cement, sent out runners to collect the crews of masons and quarriers, at dusk set them to rebuilding the tower. They worked all night, but it took time for cement to harden. If the enemy artillery opened fire too soon, his defense would be leveled. He gazed up at the campanile, its crenellated cornice wider by 4 feet all around than the shaft of the tower. If there were a way to hang something from those parapets, something that could absorb the impact of the iron and stone cannonballs before they could strike the tower itself. He made his way down the hill, crossed the Ponte Vecchio, obliged the guards to awaken the new Gonfaloni. Francesco Carducci explained his device, obtained a written order and a company of militia. By first light they were beating on the doors of the wall shops, the warehouses and the customs sheds where wool was held for taxing purposes. Next they hunted the city for mattress covers, in shops and in private homes, then requisitioned carts to carry the material. He worked fast. By the time the sun was up he had dozens of his stoutest covers stuffed with wool and suspended by ropes across the face of the tower. When the Pope's officers learned what was going on and turned their artillery on the campanile, it was too late. Their cannonballs struck the heavy paddings which, although they gave with the impact, had 4 feet of leeway before reaching the wet stone walls. The matrices served as a shield for Michelangelo's newly cemented blocks. The cannonballs fell harmlessly into the ditch below. After firing until noon, the enemy abandoned the attack. The success of his ingenious wool buffers won him repatriation. He returned to his studio, had his first night of peaceful sleep in months. Heavy rains began to fall. The open mile of cleared fields between his walls and the enemy became a bog. There could be no attack now. Michelangelo began to paint in Temperlita and the Swan for the Duke of Ferrara. Though he worshipped the physical aspects of beauty, his art had been permeated with a sexual purity. Now he found himself indulging in a robust carnality. He portrayed Lita as a ravishingly beautiful woman, lying on a couch, with the swan nestled between her legs, the S of his long neck cupping one breast, his lips on hers. He enjoyed portraying the lusty fable. The raw overcast continued. He spent the days on the parapets, at night waited his opportunity to slip into the sacristy and carve by candlelight. The chapel was cold, full of shadows, but he was not alone. His figures were familiar friends, the dawn, the dusk, the Virgin, for although they were not fully born, they were alive in the marble, thinking, telling him what they felt about the world, just as he spoke to them and through them, of art as man's continuity, the eternality that ties together the future and the past, a means of conquering death, for as long as art lives, man does not perish. In the spring the war was resumed, but none of the battles except the one against starvation took place in Florence. Restored to his position on the militia 9, Michelangelo received reports each evening. By capturing small fortresses on the Arno, the papal army had cut off supplies from the sea. Spanish troops arrived from the south and Germans from the north to swell Pope Clement's troops. Food grew scarce. Meat vanished first, then oil, greens, flour, wine. Famine took its toll. Michelangelo gave his own daily ration to Ludovico to keep his father alive. People began eating the city's asses, dogs, cats. Summer heat baked the stones, the water supply failed, the Arno dried up, the plague struck again. Men panted for air, dropped and never rose. By mid-July 5,000 were dead within the city. Florence had only one chance to survive, through its heroic general Francesco Ferrucci, whose army was near Pisa. Plans were laid for him to attack by way of Lucca and Pistoia and lift the siege. The last 16,000 men within the walls who were able to fight took the sacrament, vowing to storm the enemy camps on both sides of the city, while General Ferrucci struck from the west. General Malatesta betrayed the Republic. He refused to help Ferrucci. Ferrucci hit hard, was on the verge of victory, when Malatesta treated with the Pope's generals. Ferrucci was defeated and killed. Florence capitulated. Malatesta's troops opened the gates. Pope Clement's representatives entered the city to take control in the name of the Medici. Florence agreed to hand over 80,000 ducats as back pay to the papal armies. Those members of the government who could, fled, others were hanged from the Bargello or thrown into the stench. All members of the militia 9 were condemned. "You'd better get out of the city this very night," Bogardini urged Michelangelo. "The Pope will show no mercy. You built the defenses against him." "I can't run again," replied Michelangelo wearily. "Take refuge in the attic in my house," offered Granexi. "I will not endanger your family. As official architect, I have the keys of the Duomo. I can hide you there," cried Baxodagnolo. Michelangelo was thoughtful. "I know a tower on the other side of the Arno. No one will suspect it. I'll take refuge there until Malatesta clears out with his troops." He bade his friends farewell and made his way by back passages to the Arno, crossed the river and slipped silently to the bell tower of San Nicolo, knocking at the house next door, which belonged to the stonemason sons of Oldbipi of the Duomo workyard, to let them know he was taking refuge. Then he locked the door of the tower behind him, climbed its circular wooden staircase and spent the rest of the night staring over the hills at the deserted enemy camp. At sunrise he was still leaning against the stone walls gazing sightlessly at the terrain he had leveled to protect the city-state. Looking inward and backward, his own 55 years seemed as to worn down, and uselessly so, as a mile of leveled ground below him. He reckoned the account of the years since Pope Leo had forced him to abandon the work on Julius' tomb. What did he have to show for those 14 years? A risen Christ which, Sebastiano had tearfully reported from Rome, had been injured by the inept apprentice who had removed the webbing between the legs and feet, and who had idiotically overlicked the face while polishing. A victory which today, even more than the day he finished it, seemed confused. 4 giants still rotting in their blocks in the Via Mazza. A Moses and 2 young slaves in a house in Rome that had been plundered by an invading army. Nothing. Nothing finished, nothing put together, made whole, delivered. And a one-armed, crippled David standing as a symbol of the vanquished republic. Not only cities were besieged and sacked. Man too was beleaguered. Lorenzo had said that the forces of destruction were everywhere, overtaking everything and everybody within their range. That was all he had known since the days of Savonarola, conflict. Perhaps his father and uncle Francesco had been right to try to beat some sense into him. Whom had he enriched or made happy? He had spent a lifetime tearing himself apart, enduring the terribility of his own nature in an attempt to create beautiful marbles, meaningful statues. He had loved the sculptor's art since he was born. He had wanted only to revive it, recreate it, bring to it newer, greater conceptions. Had he wanted too much? For himself, and for his time? So very long ago his friend Jacopo Galli had told Cardinal Grosley of San Dionigi, "Michelangelo will make you the most beautiful marble to be seen in Rome today, such that no master of our own time will be able to produce a better." And here he was, a self-incarcerated prisoner cowering in an ancient bell tower, afraid to come down for fear he would be hanged from the Bargello as he had seen so many hanged during his youth. What an inglorious end for the pure bright fire that had burned in his bosom. Between midnight chimes and cockcrow he walked along the upper marshes of the Arno, returning to find that food and water had been left for him, and the news of the day jotted down by Minnie. Gonfaloni Riccarducci had been decapitated in the courtyard of the Bargello. Girolami, who had succeeded him as Gonfaloni, had been taken to Pisa and poisoned. Francis Benedetto, a priest who had sided with the Republic, had been taken to Rome to be starved to death in Sant'Angelo. All who had escaped were outlawed, their property confiscated. Florence knew where he was hiding, but the somnolent hatred for Pope Clement, his generals and troops was so intense that he was not only safe from exposure but had become a hero. Lodovico, whom Michelangelo had sent to Pisa with Buonarroti's 2 sons during the worst stage of the siege, returned without Buonarroti. The boy had died in Pisa. On a mid-November day he heard someone calling his name, loud and clear. Gazing downward from the bell tower, he saw Giovanni Spina huddled in a huge fur coat, hands cupped to his mouth as he cried upward, "Michelangelo, come down." He took the circular wooden stairs 3 at a time, unbolted the door, saw Spina's long narrow eyes gleaming. "The Pope has pardoned you. He sent word through Prior Giovanni that if you were found you were to be treated kindly, your pension restored, and the house by San Lorenzo." "Why?" "The Holy Father wants you to return to work in the sacristy." While Michelangelo gathered his things, Spina surveyed the tower. "It's freezing up here. What did you use to keep warm?" "Indignation," said Michelangelo. "Best fuel I know. Never burns out." As he walked through the streets in the late autumn sun, he let his fingers trail over the pietra serena blocks of the houses. Slowly they imparted their warmth to him. His breath came fast at the thought of returning to the Capella. His studio in the Via Mazza had been thoroughly ransacked by the papal troops who had searched for him. Even the chimney and chests had been looked into. Nothing had been stolen. In the chapel he found the scaffolding removed, probably to keep the clergy of San Lorenzo warm, but none of his marbles had been disturbed. After 3 years of war he could resume work. 3 years. As he stood in the center of his allegorical blocks he divined that time too was a tool. A major work of art required months, years for its emotional elements to solidify. Time was the East. Many aspects of the day and dusk, the Madonna, which had eluded him before, now seemed clear to him, their form matured, their definition resolved. A work of art meant growth from the particular to the universal. To a work of art, time brought timelessness. After a light supper with Lodovico he returned to the Via Mazza studio. Minnie was out. He lighted an oil lamp, walked about the studio touching familiar pieces of furniture. It was good to be home again. Among his few possessions, the Battle of the Centaurs and his Madonna of the Stairs hanging on the back wall, the 4 unfinished captives still facing each other in an intimate circle in the center of the studio. He took out his folios of drawings, leafed through them approvingly, or made a stabbing correction line with a stubby pen. Then he turned over a drawing sheet and wrote with deep emotion, "Too much good luck, no less than misery, may kill a man condemned to mortal pain. If, lost to hope and chilled in every vein, a sudden pardon comes to set him free. Beauteous art, which, brought with us from heaven, will conquer nature, so divine a power belongs to him who strives with every nerve. If I was made for art, from childhood given, a prey for burning beauty to devour, I blame the mistress I was born to serve." Baccio Valori, new governor of Florence for Pope Clement, sent for him to come to the Medici palace. Michelangelo wondered. Valori had helped drive Soderini out of Florence in 1512. But Valori was all smiles as he sat behind the desk from which Il Magnifico had guided the destinies of Florence. "Buonarroti, I need you. It is always good to be needed, signore. I want you to design a house for me, so I can build it once. And along with it, one of your great marble sculptures for the courtyard. You do me too much honor, muttered Michelangelo as he descended the broad staircase. But Granixi was delighted. It's your turn to woo the enemy. Valor loathes the company. He knows we were anti-Medici. If you do as he asks, we'll all be reprieved. Michelangelo walked to the house on the Via Ghibellina. In a wool-padded storage bin in the kitchen stood the experimental David he had carved from the marble Bepi had bought for him, the David whose foot rested on Goliath's black, bloody head. With a little chiseling the head of Goliath would disappear, and in its place would be a round sphere. The world. David would become a new Apollo. The family home seemed empty and forlorn. He missed Buonarroti. Sigismundo, who had been part of the Florentine army for the past 3 years, asked permission to live on the family farm in Settignano. Giovan Simone was determined to have Michelangelo finance the reopening of the wall shop. Lodovico had grown feeble, so stricken by the death of his young grandchild Buonarroti that he was unable to recount what had happened to the boy. 11-year-old Leonardo was the remaining hope and satisfaction of the Buonarroti family, inheritor of the family name. Michelangelo had paid for his 3 years of education. Uncle Michelangelo, could I be apprenticed to you? As a sculptor? Michelangelo was aghast. Aren't you a sculptor? Yes. But it is not a life I would wish on my only nephew. I think you would be happier apprenticed to the strife for the wool trade. Until then, suppose you come to the studio and take over your father's account books. I need someone to make the entries. The boy's brown eyes, with the amber flecks so similar to Buonarroti's and his own, lighted. Returning to the Via Mozza, he found Minnie entertaining a lavishly gowned emissary from the Duke of Ferrara. Maestro Buonarroti, I have come to collect the painting you promised to my Duke. It is finished. When he brought out the Leda and the Swan, the emissary stared at it in silence. After a moment he said, "This is but a trifle. My Duke expected a masterpiece." Michelangelo studied the tempora, gazing with satisfaction at the voluptuous Leda. "May I ask what your business is, signore?" "I am a merchant." "Haughtily. Then your Duke will find you have made a bad bargain for him. Be so kind as to remove yourself from my studio." He resumed work in the chapel, again hiring brickmasons and cement men. Instead of working his allegories on turntables to catch the changing light, he had them propped with wooden blocks at the angle at which the figures would rest on the sarcophagi, and in the position in the chapel they would ultimately occupy. In this way he would make the most effective use of the actual light and shadow they would absorb. In designing the 4 reclining figures for the 2 tombs, his problem was to hold the visual attention and not let it drain downward off the arc of the curved tomb cover. To this end he created a countercurve in the torso, with one leg of each figure bent upward in high projection, the other with outstretched toes extending to the farthest edge of the block. The abrupt upward thrust into space of the leg would hold his shoulder-to-shoulder figures on their precarious ledges. It was cold in the chapel from the outside rains, and penetratingly damp from the water oozing out of the slow-drying cement of the brick-top windows. He sometimes felt his teeth chattering even when moving with high speed through the marble. At night when he returned to his own studio he found his head filled with mucus, his throat raw. He ignored the difficulties, grimly determined that this project must not become another Julius tomb. Sebastiano continued to write from Rome. The Pietà had been exposed to danger in its chapel, but no man had dared injure the dead Jesus on his mother's lap. The Bacchus had been buried by Jacopo Galli's family in the orchard outside his old workshed and had now been set up again. He, Sebastiano had been appointed the Pope's keeper of the seals, become a friar, with a handsome salary, and was now known as Sebastiano del Piombo. As for the house on the Macello de Corvi, the plaster of the walls and ceilings was crumbling, most of the furnishings had vanished, the buildings around the edge of the garden had been torn down for firewood. His marbles were safe, but the house was in desperate need of attention. Couldn't Michelangelo send money to have the repairs made? Michelangelo had no money to send. Florence had not recovered from the war, food and materials were scarce, trade was so poor that his outlay for the family shop was lost each month. Valori ruled with a harsh hand. Pope Clement kept the various factions of Florence at each other's throats. The city had hoped that Ippolito, the gentle, sweet-natured son of Giuliano, would replace Valori, but Pope Clement had other plans. Ippolito was made a cardinal, against his strongest wishes, and sent to Hungary as commander of the Italian forces against the Turks. Clement's own son, known as Alessandro the Moor because of his swarthy skin and thick lips, was brought to Florence with great ceremony and made sovereign of the city-state for life. A dissolute, ugly youth of low intelligence and rapacious appetites, with his father's troops on hand to enforce his slightest wish, Alessandro murdered his opponents in broad daylight, raped and debauched the youth of the city, wiped out its last semblances of freedom, and quickly brought it to a state of anarchy. Equally quickly, Michelangelo fought with Alessandro. When Alessandro asked him to design a new fort above the Arno, Michelangelo declined. When Alessandro sent word that he wished to show the chapel to the visiting viceroy of Naples, Michelangelo locked the sacristy. "Your conduct is dangerous," cautioned Giovanni Spina. "I'm safe until I complete the tomb." Clement has made that clear, even to his thick-skulled son. Or I would have been dead long ago. He laid down his chisels, wiped the marble dust from his face and eyebrows, looked about him and exclaimed with gratification, "This chapel will outlive Alessandro, even if I don't." "You won't, I'm sure of that. You are emaciated, you have a racking cough. Why don't you walk in the hills in the warm sun, cure your cold, put some merciful flesh on your bones?" Michelangelo sat on the edge of a plank placed between the two sawhorses, answered thoughtfully, "There is nothing left of the good in Florence, of order, except its art. When I stand before this marble day with a hammer and chisel in my hands, I feel that I am fulfilling the law of Moses through an art form, to compensate for the spiritual degradation of Alessandro and his bullies. Which will survive, these marble sculptures or the debauchery? Then at least let me move the marbles to a warm, dry room. I have to carve them here, Spina, where the light is exactly what it will do when they are on the sarcophagi." In the studio that evening he found a request from Giovanni Battista, Minnie's uncle. The boy had fallen hopelessly in love with an impoverished widow's daughter and wanted to marry her. His uncle thought he ought to be sent out of the country. Could Michelangelo help? When Minnie returned from the night's diversion, Michelangelo asked him, "Do you love this girl?" "Passionately," said Minnie. "Is it the same girl you loved passionately last summer?" "Of course not." "Then take this painting of Leda and the Swan. And these drawings. The money from them will set you up in a studio in Paris." "But the Leda is worth a fortune," exclaimed Minnie, astonished. "Then see that you get a fortune for her. Write to me from France." Minnie had no sooner beaten north than a young man of about 20 presented himself at the door of the studio, introducing himself as Francesco Amador. "Though I am called Herbino," he added in a quiet voice. "The priest at San Lorenzo told me you needed someone. What kind of job are you looking for?" "I seek a home, Signor Buonarrotti, and a family, for I have none." Later, I should like to marry and have a family of my own, but I must work for many years first. I come of humble people and have only these clothes on my back. You wish to become a sculpture apprentice? An art apprentice, Messier. Michelangelo studied the man standing before him, his clothes threadbare but neat, lean to the point of boniness, with a convex stomach that had never known its fill, steady gray eyes, dust-gray teeth and light, ash-gray hair. Urbino needed a home and employment, yet his manner had dignity, and inner quietude. Apparently he respected himself, and this Michelangelo liked. Very well, let us try. Urbino had a nobility of spirit which illuminated everything he did. He was so overjoyed to belong somewhere that he filled the house with his own happiness, treating Michelangelo with the reverence due a father. Michelangelo found himself growing attached to the young man. Pope Clement again urged Julius' heirs to negotiate a release. The rovers, though they felt insulted and put upon, agreed orally to accept the single-faced wall tomb, ornamented by the figures which Michelangelo had already carved. He was to relinquish to Moses and 2 slaves, finish the 4 captives, and ship them with the victory to Rome. All that remained for him to do was make drawings for the other figures and raise 2,000 ducats to return to the rovers, who would pay it over to another marble master to complete the sepulchre. After 27 years of worry, and 8 major sculptures for which he was not to receive 1 scudo of wage, he would be freed from his self-imposed hell. He could not sell any one of his farms or houses for the necessary 2,000 ducats. No one in Tuscany had any money. The only building for which he could get a fair offer was the Via Mazza studio. "I'm heartbroken," he cried to Spina. "I love this bottega." Spina sighed. "Let me write to Rome. Perhaps we can arrange to have the money payment postponed." Giovansimone chose this moment to come to the Via Mazza for one of his rare visits. "I want the big house in the Via di San Piccolo," he announced. "For what?" "To set myself up in style." "It's rented." "We don't need the rent money." "Perhaps you don't, but I do." "For what?" "You're rich enough." "Giovansimone, I'm struggling to pay a debt to the rovers." "That's just your excuse. You're stingy, like father." "Have you ever lacked for anything?" "My proper place in life." "We are noble burghers." "Then act nobly." "I haven't the money." "You keep hoarding it." "Giovansimone, you're 53 years old, and you have never supported yourself." "I have supported you for 34 years, ever since Savonarola's death." "You get no praise for doing your duty." "You speak as though we were vulgar artisans." "Our family is as old as the Medici, Strai or Tornabuoni. We have been paying taxes in Florence for 3 centuries. "You sound like father," replied Michelangelo wearily. "We have the right to display the Medici crest. I want to set it up in front of the Via di San Piccolo house, hire servants." "You're forever protesting that everything you do is for our family." "Well then, prove it. Dig out the words and fill the hole with gold." "Giovansimone, you couldn't see a black crow in a bowl of milk." "I don't have the resources to make a Florentine nobleman out of you." He heard that Sigismondo had moved into the peasants' quarters in Settignano and was working the land. He rode up the hill to find Sigismondo behind a plough guiding 2 white oxen, his face and hair under a straw hat wet with perspiration, manure caked on 1 boot. "Sigismondo, you're working like a contadino." Sigismondo took off his hat, wiped his forehead with a heavy club-like movement of his forearm. "I just plowed a field." "But why?" "We have tenants here to do the manual labor." "I like to work." "But not as a laborer." "Sigismondo, what can you be thinking of? No Buonarrotti has worked with his hands for 300 years. except you." Michelangelo flushed. "I am a sculptor. What will people in Florence say when they hear my brother is working like a peasant? After all, the Buonarroti have been noble burghers. We have a coat of arms. Coat of arms won't feed me. I'm too old to fight now, so I work. This is our land. I raise wheat and olives and grapes. Do you have to walk in dung to do it?" Sigismundo looked down at his crusted boot. "Dung fertilizes the field. I've worked all my life to make the Buonarroti name honored throughout Italy. Do you want people to say that I have a brother in Settignano who tends oxen?" Sigismundo gazed at his two handsome white animals, replied with affection, "Oxen is nice. They are beautiful animals. Now go take yourself a bath, get into clean clothes, and let one of our renters plow the furrows." He lost both arguments. Giovansimone spread the word in Florence that his brother Michelangelo was a miser and a vulgarian who refused to allow his family to live according to their high rank in Tuscan society. Sigismundo spread the word in Settignano that his brother Michelangelo was a snob and aristocrat who thought his family had become too good for honest labor. As a result, both brothers got what they wanted: more money for Giovansimone to spend, the land for Sigismundo to tend. He concentrated on the two female figures, dawn and night. Except for the Madonnas, he had never sculptured a woman. He had no desire to portray young girls at the threshold of life. He wanted to carve fertility, the bounteous body which brings forth the race of man, mature women who had labored and been in labor, with bodies fatigued but indomitable. Did he have to be androgynous to create authentic women? All artists were androgynous. He carved Dawn as not yet awake, caught in the transition between dream and reality, her head still resting wearily on her shoulder, a band drawn tight under the breasts to emphasize spatially their bulbous quality, the stomach muscles sagging, the womb exhausted from bearing, the whole arduous journey of her life in the half-closed eyes and half-open mouth, the left arm bent and suspended in air, ready to fall as soon as she lifted her head from her shoulder to face the day. He moved a few steps across the chapel to work on the sumptuously voluptuous figure of Night, still young, fertile, desirable, cradle of man, the exquisite Greek head resting on its delicately arched neck, eyes closed and resigning to sleep in darkness, tension reflected through the long limp figure and plastic manipulations of flesh to give a quality of sensuality which he would heighten with a high polish. Light moving freely on the contours of the milky marble would intensify the female forms, the hard ripe breasts, fount of sustenance, the magnificently robust thigh, the arm pulled sharply behind the back to turn the breast proudly outward, every man's dream of the beauteous, bounteous female body, ready for sleep, love, fecundation. He polished the figure with straw and sulfur, remembering how his ancestors, the Etruscans, had carved reclining stone figures for the lids of their sarcophagi. He finished Dawn in June, and Night in August, two heroic marble carvings in the 9 months since he had left his tower, pouring out his inner power over the hot dry summer, then turned to the male figures of day and dusk, leaving strong calligraphic textures about the head, doing no filing or polishing because the tool markings in themselves denoted vigorous masculinity. With day, a wise, strong man who knew every aspect of life's passing pain and pleasure, he carved the head sweeping out over its own massive shoulder and forearm, reflecting in its muscle torso a back that had lifted and carried the weights of the world. Dusk was a portrait of his own sunken-eyed, bony-nosed, bearded face, the head diagonally reclining like the sinking sun as it dipped toward the horizon, the gnarled expression of the features reflected in the labored hands, the strong mottled knees raised and crossed, leg extending outward on its thin shelf of marble beyond the tomb itself. He had studied anatomy to acquaint himself with the inner physical workings of man. Now he treated the marble as having an anatomy of its own. In this chapel he wanted to leave something of himself, something which time itself could not erase. He finished dusk in September. The rain started, the chapel became cold and raw. Again his flesh vanished, he was down to bone and gristle, under 100 pounds as he picked up hammer and chisel to siphon the blood of his veins, his marrow and calcium into the veins and bones of the day, the Virgin and Child, the statue of a seated, contemplative Lorenzo. As the marbles grew throbbingly alive, vibrant, powerful, lusty, he became correspondingly drained. It was from his own inner storehouse of will, courage, daring and brain that the marbles were infused with their eternal energies. His last ounce of strength he poured into the immortality of the marbles. It won't do, you know. This time it was Ecstasy who reproved him, a Ecstasy who himself had grown lean over the misfortunes of his city. Death from overindulgence is a form of suicide, whether it's from work or wine. If I don't work 20 hours a day I'll never finish. It's the other way around. If you would have the good sense to rest you could live forever. It's been forever. Ecstasy shook his head. At 57 you have the force of a man of 30. Me, I'm worn out. From pleasure. With your luck, why should you think that dying is going to be any easier than living? Michelangelo laughed for the first time in weeks. Smiled. How poor my life would have been without your friendship. It's your fault. This sculpturing. You took me to Lorenzo's garden, you encouraged me. Ecstasy chuckled. You never wanted to do tombs, yet you've spent most of your life on marbles for tombs. All your years you said you would never do portraits, and here you are stuck with 2 of them, life-size. You're dreaming. You're not going to carve the portraits for the niches? Assuredly not. Who will know 100 years from now whether my marbles are good likenesses of young Lorenzo and Giuliano? I'm going to carve universal figures of action and contemplation. They will be nobody, yet everybody. A subject is a farm wagon to carry a sculptor's ideas to market. Urbino had been taught to read and write by the priests at Castel Durante. Slowly he slipped into the position of steward of both the household and the studio. Now that his nephew Leonardo was doing well as an apprentice to the Strai, Michelangelo gave Urbino the books to keep. Urbino paid the wages and bills, assumed the role Buonarrotti had played when he was young, became a protector who could make Michelangelo's life smoother, take the petty annoyances off his shoulders. Michelangelo came to have a feeling of permanence about the relationship. He rested by moving into clay models, mixing in cloth frayings to make the clay fattier so that it would be more responsive to his manipulation, needing the composition to adhere to the armature. The dampness of the clay was so similar to the dampness of the chapel that he felt he was shaping the wet raw interior space of the sacristy. Transferring from the clay to the marble block, he carved the statue of young Lorenzo for the niche above dawn and dusk, using an architectonic approach, designing this figure of contemplation to be static, tight, withdrawn, involved in its own interior brooding. For contrast he evolved an action composition of Giuliano for over the tomb holding the day and night on the opposite wall, loose, with the circulation of tension and a continuous state of motion. Lorenzo's head was well set and compressed into his shoulders, Giuliano sat with a sudden thrust of the neck into space. It was the Madonna and Child from which he took his joy. He longed to the very fibers and roots of his soul to give her a divine beauty, her face glowing with love and compassion, the birthplace and the resurgent future, instrument of the Godhead through which the human race, in the face of its adversities and tragedies, endures. He saw the mother and child theme all fresh and shining, as though he had never carved it before, intense desire and intense fulfillment. The child twisted about on his mother's lap, vigorously seeking nourishment, the elaborate folds of the mother's gown heightening the agitation, externalizing her feeling of fulfillment and pain as the greedy, earthy child sucked. He felt lightheaded, somehow as though he were back in his first studio, carving the Madonna for the merchants of Bruges. Back in his period of grace. It was only a high fever. When it passed he was so weak his legs could barely hold him. The Pope sent a carriage and driver to Florence, ordering Michelangelo to come to Rome to recuperate in the warmth of the more southerly sun, and to hear about an exciting new project he had envisaged. Clement invited Michelangelo's friends in the Florentine colony for a dinner at the Vatican, had several comedies played to amuse him. Clement's solicitude for his health was genuine, almost like that of a beloved brother. Then the Pope revealed his desire: would Michelangelo like to paint a Last Judgment on the vast altar wall of the Sistine Chapel? At the dinner Michelangelo met a young man of singular beauty, like that of the Greek youths he had painted behind the Holy Family he had made for Agony. He had eyes of a luminous serena grey-blue, a classical nose and mouth carved out of flesh-colored marble by Praxiteles, a high, rounded forehead in perfect plumb with the big-boned, curved chin, chestnut hair, long, symmetrically carved cheeks with high cheekbones, and the rose-bronzed skin of the youths who competed in the stadia of Greece. Tommaso da Cavalieri, 22, well-educated, serious, was the heir of a patrician Roman family. Ambitious to become a first-rate painter, he asked eagerly if he might become an apprentice. The admiration in Tommaso's eyes amounted almost to idolatry. Michelangelo replied that he must return to Florence to finish the Medici chapel, but there was no reason why they could not spend some part of his time in Rome drawing together. The young man's intense concentration as he watched Michelangelo achieve his volatile effects was enormously flattering. Michelangelo found Tommaso to be a talented, conscientious worker, delightful and simpatico. Tommaso had the welcome faculty of making the 35-year difference between their ages dissolve, so that in Tommaso's presence he felt young, was able to laugh, to be taken out of himself. When they parted they agreed to write to each other. Michelangelo volunteered to send special drawings from which Tommaso could study, and to send word when he had arrived at his decision for the Pope. Back in Florence he returned to the sacristy refreshed. By spring he had forgotten about dyeing. In achieving his skin finishes on the two male figures he used the cross-hatching method first taught him by Galanteio with the pen, one set of calligraphic lines made by the tooth chisel superimposed over a set of agnuto lines, at right angles so that the finer tooth marks of the chisel would not fall into the heavier and more prominent tracks of the agnuto. He emerged with textures of skin that had all the tension and pull of living tissue. On the Madonna's cheeks he achieved a soft, pebbly texture. The beauty of her face was sublime. Time was not a mountain but river, it changed its rate of flow as well as its course. It could become swollen, overflow its banks, or dry to a trickle. It could run clean and pure along its bed or become laden with silt and throw up debris along the shore. When Michelangelo was young, every day had been particularized. It had had body, content, shape, stood out as an individual entity to be numbered, recorded and remembered. Now time was insoluble, the weeks and months merged in a continuous flow at an ever-accelerated speed. He was getting as much work done but the very texture of time had altered for him, its arbitrary boundaries become indistinct. The years were no longer individual blocks but a Puan Alps which man in his need broke into separate peaks. Were the weeks and months really shorter in duration, or had he stopped counting, adopted a different measure? Formerly time had had a hard brittle quality, being a solid. Now it was a fluid. Its landscape had become as different for him as was the Roman Campagna from Tuscany. He had imagined time to be absolute, the same always, everywhere, to all men. Now he saw that it was as variable as human nature or the weather of the skies. As 1531 became 1532, as 1532 began contracting and converging on 1533, he asked himself, "Where does time go?" The answer was plain enough. It had been transmuted from the amorphous to the substantive by becoming part of the life force of the Madonna and Child, of the dawn and dusk and night, the young Medici. What he had not understood was that time became foreshortened, just as space did. When he stood on a hill looking across a Tuscan valley, the front half was visible in all its lucid detail. The more distant half, though as wide and broad, was compacted, compressed, jammed up, seeming to be a narrow belt instead of widely extensive fields. This happened to time in the more distant area of a man's life as well. No matter how closely he peered at the hours and days as they went by, they seemed shorter when compared to the wide-flung first portion of his life. He carved the two lids of the sarcophagi in severely pure lines, that descending curves ending in a chaste convolute, a few simple leaves sculptured as the top of the supporting columns. He did nothing about the river gods or about symbols of heaven and earth, ideas he had developed in a preliminary stage. He carved a mask below the outward shoulder of night, and put an owl in the right angle formed by her raised knee. That was all. For him the beauty of man had always been the beginning and the end of art. Word of what he was essaying in the chapel spread through Italy and then Europe. He welcomed serious artists, who sketched her and made notes while he worked, but the increasing flow of sightseers got under his skin. One elaborately gowned nobleman demanded, "How did you come to make that astonishing figure of night?" "I had a block of marble in which was concealed that statue which you see there. The only effort involved is to take away the tiny pieces which surround it and prevent it from being seen. For anyone who knows how to do this, nothing could be easier. Then I shall send my servant to look for statues in the stones." He made a journey to San Miniato al Tedesco to visit with Pope Clement, who was on his way to solemnize the marriage of Caterina de' Medici, daughter of Piero's son Lorenzo, to the Dauphin of France. He had a happy time with Cardinal Ippolito, now attached to the Pope, and with Sebastiano del Piombo, still a favorite of Clement's. For the rest, he remained within the quadrangle formed by the Medici sacristy where he carved, the house across the street where he made his models, and the Via Mazza studio where he lived and was cared for by Urbino. As drained of suet and sinew as he knew himself to be, he considered himself fortunate in having surrounded himself with good sculptors who were helping him conclude the chapel. Tribolo, who was to carve the marble heaven and earth from Michelangelo's models, Angelo Monticelli, who was going to do a street. Cosmas, Raffaello di Mondolfo, son of his old friend Baccio, clown of the Medici sculpture garden who had finished his two Piccolomini popes. Sometimes at night he refreshed himself by picking up drawing materials and surveying his mind to see what it might have to say about a last judgment. Bandinelli finished his Hercules for Clement. Duke Alessandro gave the order to have it installed opposite the David, in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, which he had renamed the Palazzo Vecchio because Florence was to have no more ruling council. The public outcry against the statue was so great that Bandinelli had to go to Rome to get a papal order to have it set up. Michelangelo walked with Urbino through the Piazza della Signoria to see the Hercules, the pieces of paper stuck to it during the night fluttering in the wind. He winced as he looked up at Bandinelli's meaningless muscle bulges. After reading a few of the verses he commented with a grimace, "Bandinelli is going to be unhappy when he reads these tributes." Then he remembered Leonardo da Vinci's prophecy in the Belvedere. The painter, after he studies your ceiling, must take not to become wooden through too strong an emphasis on bone, muscle and sinus. What do painters do, when they try to go beyond you? He understood now what Leonardo had been trying to tell him. Don't complete your own revolution. Leave something for those who follow you. But even if he had understood Leonardo earlier, what could he have done about it? Like the Carini, he had been a campanilista, rallying around the base of Giotto's bell tower as though it were the center of the universe. But Florence was supine now, its freedom strangled by Alessandro. Since art was being strangled in the same bloody bed with political liberty, most of the company of the Cauldron had moved to other cities. The Florence of the early Medici had vanished. The Orcagna and Donatello marbles still stood majestically in the niches of Ors and Michele, but Florentines walked the streets with their heads bowed, after the interminable wars and defeats. The mule of the mule, the Moor, was the final blow. When he passed the Marzocchi in the Piazza della Signoria, Michelangelo turned his head away. He could not even bring himself to repair David's broken arm, not until the Republic, the greatness of Florence as an art and intellectual center, the Athens of Europe, had been restored. Lodovico's 90th birthday fell on an exhilarating day in June 1534. The air was warm but piercingly clear. Florence glistened like a precious stone in its throng of mountains. Michelangelo gathered the remnants of the Buonarrotti family. At the dinner table there were Lodovico, so feeble that he had to be propped with pillows, Giovanni Simone, wan and thin from a protracted illness, silent Sigismondo, living his life alone on the family farm where they had all been born, Secca, Buonarroti's 17-year-old daughter, and young Leonardo, who was completing his apprenticeship to the Strati. Uncle Michelangelo, you promised you would reopen my father's wool shop as soon as I was ready to manage it. So I shall, Leonardo. Soon? I'm 50 now, and I've learned the business quite well. Yes, soon, Leonardo, as soon as I can get my affairs straightened out. Lodovico ate only a few spoonfuls of the soup carried to his lips with trembling hands. In the middle of dinner he asked to be taken to his bed. Michelangelo picked his father up in his arms. He weighed no more than the tied bundles of sticks Michelangelo had used to protect his walls at San Miniato. He put his father in bed, tucked a blanket around him. The old man turned his head slightly so that he could see the pie-shaped desk with its account books, neatly stacked. A smile came over his ash-gray lips. Michelangelo. The pet name. Lodovico had not used it for years. Messer Padre. I wanted to live. To be 90. And so you have. But it was hard. I have worked every minute, just to stay alive. It's as good a work as any I know. But now, I'm tired. Rest. I'll close the door. Michelangelo. Yes, father. You will take of the boys. Giovanni Simone. Sigismondo. Michelangelo thought, the boys. In their middle 50s. Aloud he replied, our family is all I have, father. They'll give Leonardo his shop when he is ready. And Secca a dowry? Yes, father. Then all is well. I have kept my family together. We have prospered, gained back the money my father lost. My life has not been lived in vain. Please call the father from Santa Croce. Leonardo brought the priest. Lodovico died quietly, surrounded by his 3 sons, grandson and granddaughter. There was so much color left in his cheeks, and his face looked so peaceful, that Michelangelo could not believe his father was dead. He felt strangely alone. He had been without a mother all his life, and without love from his father, without affection or understanding. Yet none of that mattered now. He had loved his father, just as in his flinty Tuscan way Lodovico had loved his son. The world would seem empty, even forlorn, without him. Lodovico had caused him endless anguish, yet it had not been Lodovico's fault that only one of his 5 sons had been an earner. That was why he had had to work Michelangelo so hard, to make up for the other 4 who had added nothing to the account books on a pie-shaped desk. Michelangelo was proud that he had been able to fulfill Lodovico's ambition, enable his father to die a success. That night he sat in his studio, the big doors open to the garden, writing under an oil lamp. Suddenly the garden and his room were invaded by thousands of small white moths, called manna from the Hebraic desert, weaving a net around the lamp and his head, flying in patterns like birds. In a few moments they were dead, leaving the studio and garden looking as though a light snow had fallen. He brushed the thick layer of ephemera off his workbench, picked up a pen and wrote, "Death is less hard to him who wearily bears back to God a harvest fully ripe, than 'tis to him in full and freshest mind. But cruel were the heart that did not weep, that he should see no more about this earth. Him who gave being first, and then support. Our grief's intensity, our weight of woe, are less or more, according as each feels. And all my outer weakness, Lord, thou knowest." He stood alone in the sacristy under the dome he had designed and built, surrounded by the Beatrice Serena and marble walls so lovingly co-joined. Lorenzo, the contemplative, was in his niche. Giuliano was sitting on the floor, not quite finished. Thesz, the last of the 7 figures, was propped onto the shoulders with wooden blocks, the back of the powerful male body unfinished where it would stand against the wall. The face, poised behind a high-raised shoulder, was that of an eagle, gazing stonily at the world through deep-sunk eyes, the hair, nose and beard rough-grizzled, as though cut out of granite, a strange, primordial contrast to the highlighted skin of the massive protective shoulder. Was the chapel finished? After 14 years? Standing midst his exquisitely carved sarcophagi on either side, each to hold its 2 giant figures, dawn and dusk, day and night, the beauteous Madonna and Child sitting on her ledge against the spacious side wall, he felt that he had carved everything he had wanted to carve, and said everything he had wanted to say. For him the Medici chapel was complete. He believed that Il Magnifico would have been gratified, that he would have accepted this chapel and these marble sculptures in place of the facade he had envisaged. He picked up a piece of drawing paper, wrote instructions for his 3 sculptors to mount day and night on their sarcophagus, dusk and dawn opposite. He left the note on a plank table under a piece of scrap marble, turned and went out the door without looking back. Urbino packed his saddlebags. "Do you have everything, Urbino?" "All except the folios of drawings, Messire. They will be ready in a few moments. Wrap them in my flannel shirts for protection." They mounted their horses, crossed the city and went out the Porta Romana. At the top of the rise he stopped, turned to look back at the Duomo, Baptistery and Campanile, at the tawny tower of the Palazzo Vecchio glistening in the September sunlight, at the exquisite city of stone nestled under its red tile roof. It was hard to take leave of one's city, hard to feel that, close to 60, he could not count on returning. Resolutely he turned the horses south toward Rome. "Let us push on, Urbino. We'll stay the night at Poughkeepsie, at an inn I know there." "And will we be in Rome by the following nightfall?" Urbino asked excitedly. "What is Rome like, Messer?" He tried to describe Rome, but his heart was too heavy. He had no idea what the future held for him, though he was certain that his own interminable war was at last over. If the astrologists who centered around the Porta Romana had cried out to him as he passed that he still had before him a third of his years, 2 of the 4 loves of his life, the longest, bloodiest battle, and some of his finest sculpture, painting and architecture, he would have remembered Il Magnifico's contempt for their pseudoscience, and he would have laughed, tiredly. But they would have been right.